Thanks, Mrs. Georgette, for your time. Let me start my question. Your report shows that the increase of 15% of civilian casualties in past 6 months. How alarming is this figure?
In our view, and for all Afghans, especially civilians, an increase in their deaths from conflict is very alarming. And 15% is many people, many children, women, and men. And this figure represents about 1,462 people who've been killed in the last 6 months from the conflict.
More than 80% of the casualties are attributed to the anti-government elements. Does it mean that the Taliban violating law of war?
Yes, that is our view, that some of the tactics they use, in particular deliberately killing civilians, and also the use of a certain kind of IED, are violations of what we call international humanitarian law, or the law of war.
Do you expect the Taliban to obey the law of war and to not harm the civilians?
We certainly expect that, because as a party to this conflict, they have a legal obligation under the laws of war to obey these laws of war. And they also have their own code of conduct, which has some provisions on reducing civilian casualties.
In your report, the IEDs are the main reason and the largest single killer of the civilian, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So what is the reason why it happens by the IEDs?
Well, we've found that almost half of civilians are killed by IEDs, and a little also by suicide attacks. The IEDs are being placed in more places where civilians are, for example, in a bazaar or in a bicycle cart or next to a park. Also, it's the type of IED that's being used. It's called a pressure plate IED, which acts like an anti-personnel landmine. That means that a person weighing anywhere from 10 kilograms to 100 kilograms, and that's the weight of children and women and some men, that the minute they step on this IED, it explodes and they are killed. And there are many, many of these IEDs placed all over the country. And they are illegal because they do not discriminate between a civilian, which is a civilian, and a civilian target, which is like a minibus, and a military target, which is a tank. They don't discriminate. So any civilian or any civilian vehicle that goes on one of these, very little hope of survival of people.
Okay, so what your report shows in the past 6 months, it shows that these kind of IEDs that you named that and you mentioned that is using more by the Taliban in the past 6 months?
Yes, what we've found is there is an increased use, yes, of this type of pressure plate IED.
Have you surveyed? What's the process?
We have sources all over the country. We consult very often. These are people, eyewitnesses. We also have sources in the military, in the police, and elsewhere who are working with us to document these types of incidents and also the use of these particular kinds of IEDs. For example, both the Afghan military and the international forces have done a survey of the types of IEDs and what sort of effect they have on civilians over the past 6 months. And much of our information comes from these types of sources.
Okay.
And we've also, of course, actually seen these devices ourselves.
Okay. How do you think civilian deaths caused of foreign troops have turned into a controversial issue between President Karzai and the United States?
Yes, it's important to note that the pro-government forces, this is the international military, and the Afghan forces also do cause civilian casualties, but in a much lower number than the anti-government elements. Unfortunately, some in the government and some in the community at large have focused on the casualties caused by foreign forces. Obviously, any civilian death caused by anyone is a tragedy and needs to be highlighted. But we must really put the focus on the groups that are causing the most civilian casualties, and that's the Taliban and the anti-government elements.
Okay, so let me ask another important question. Why the Afghan government is very serious about civilian casualties made by the Taliban? I mean, they are not so serious about the civilian casualties when they are made by the Taliban, but they are so serious when the civilian casualties made by foreign troops.
Well, that's a difficult one to answer, but our view is that all civilian casualties must be denounced, and the government should be denouncing these by any party to the conflict, and as I said, really trying to focus more on the groups who are committing the most civilian casualties.
So, in your report, Taliban are responsible for 80% of the civilian casualties. But when the government is condemning the civilian casualties, it is so serious about the foreign troops, but not so serious against the Taliban that they are making some civilian casualties. So don't you think it will affect negatively on the civilian casualties in Afghanistan?
Well, one reason may be that the international forces, the Afghans here, expect them to conduct themselves in a better way, and they might have higher standards, which may be one reason why there's a focus on their conduct rather than the conduct of the anti-government elements. And some may think, oh, we expect to be killed by the anti-government elements. Our view is that no matter which party is carrying out these civilian casualties, they need to be called on it, as we say, and there needs to be a demand for them to reduce, if not end, civilian casualties.
And you are witness that when the civilian casualties are happening, but the government is not ready to even name and call the Taliban that they're responsible, and they have done this in their press releases.
Well, we would simply urge the government and everyone else to call all parties to account for the casualties they're causing, and urge all of them to abide by their obligations and stop killing civilians.
You mentioned that the Taliban are using the pressure plate IEDs. That is the most reason of increasing civilian casualties in the past 6 months. So in 1998, the Taliban signed a treaty that they're not using the IEDs, specifically these kind IEDs. Do you expect that the Taliban are not using after that these kind IEDs?
Well, what we would ask them to do, and what we're urging, especially as we lead up to Ramadan, is that they stop using these pressure plate IEDs, which are like anti-personnel landmines. And as you noted, in 1998, Mullah Omar signed a treaty, the Mine Ban Treaty, that banned this type of landmine, and the Taliban itself said then that they would ban the use of any type of landmine in their behavior. So we're calling on them to repeat that ban and to not use these types of IEDs.
So is there any guarantee? Do you think it would be any guarantee from the Taliban side?
Well, we'd like to see that, and it would be good if they could make that statement publicly.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thank you.